So today I'm going to do a little bit of blueberry maintenance. And blueberry plants are one of those things that actually do better in pots than they do in the ground. There's very few plants that benefit more from being in pots than blueberry plants. And as we all know, blueberry plants, their roots are very shallow, and they kind of basically are kind of matted all within a very small range. So this diameter around here is where the blueberry roots are. They're not very deep, and they're all clumped together, so they're not out here in the edges. Now if you look at that pH reading on my little meter there, it shows the pH right around just under 7. We'll say it's 6.75. So I'm going to knock it with two things. I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of soil acidifier, because soil, I'm going to use the aluminum sulfate, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use a little bit of peat moss to dress it, because peat moss has acidity level about 5.5. Now I know some people will go ahead and read that peat moss has a soil acidity level of 4.5 to 5.5, but I've gotten 6 different kinds of peat moss, and I've done a pH reading on all of them, and they all hover around 5.5 to 6. And so this idea that peat moss has a soil acidity of 4.5, at least in the region I'm in, 6 different brands, and all of them never had 4.5. Now, as we know, blueberry plants like a soil acidity of about 4.5 to 5.5. And so it wouldn't hurt to, overdo it on the peat moss. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use the pellets to lower the pH around my plant here, and I'm going to dress it with peat moss to give it a little bit extra nutrients and a little bit of more acidity as I water every single time. So let's go ahead and go to where the planted blueberry plants are. Must have been windy last night. So what I do in the wintertime is my blueberry plants out here, they're kind of in direct area of rain, and it does rain a lot, so much here in the wintertime, that I do put plastic down to keep it warm, and also so it doesn't just sit in water. And then I put this little dome on top with the top off, because you'd be surprised, on a nice sunny day in the dead of winter, let's say it's 50 degrees out, the roots or the stems can actually get singed with too much heat. And so I find it much better to go ahead and leave the tops off. And so I put this dome on top of this, kind of shove it in there, because this is kind of a newer blueberry plant. And I'll go ahead and lay down the black plastic to keep it warm, and also keep as much rainwater away from it as possible. So when I look at the soil here, you can see it's very alkaline. We're talking 8, right at 8. And so that pH reading is not good. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is, as I told you before, I don't like to use the soil acidifier here in this part of the Pacific Northwest, just because anytime the soil alkaline 7 or greater, soil amendments don't really work that well. So I'm going to go ahead and knock it with the aluminum sulfate. So what I'm going to do is, I am also going to fertilize today too. And so what I'm going to do is, I took this peat moss and I broke it up, and I'm going to sprinkle some aluminum sulfate in here. And I'll sprinkle that in here and work it into the mix. And mix it around. And I'm going to dress the potted blueberry plants with this same mixture too. But I'm going to go ahead and do that here. And because that soil around that dirt was running at 8, which is really, really high, because blueberries like a soil level of 4.5 to 5.5, I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle this too. You got to be careful, because if you do too much, it's going to burn the blueberry plants. But since this is It's really hovering very high. I got to get that knocked down. And so I'm going to go ahead and use the aluminum sulfate in my area, just because if the soil was 7, I can live with that, and I can probably use the soil acidifier, although it just works so darn slowly that I tend to rather use less of the aluminum sulfate, or a little bit more if it's hovering at 8 like it is on the of the blueberry plants that are already in the ground. And so what I'm going to do is I put that down, and I'm also going to go ahead and put that fertilizer down below the peat moss. So I got the shake and feed. It's for shake and feed, which is for basil, blueberries, early stages, tomatoes, and cilantro. You can go ahead and get on Amazon or eBay and get the specific you can get the specific fertilizer that's geared toward blueberries if you want to spend the extra money. I'm kind of lazy and cheap, and so I like to buy products that have more than one use. So I'll go ahead and buy products that allow me to use it on a number of different other items. So I got the fertilizer down for the early spring. Leaves are already coming in, so they are going to start forming some small blueberries. And then I'm going to put down a dressing of this aluminum sulfate with peat moss. As I water and it soaks into the ground, it's going to go ahead, lower the acidity, and on top of that, it will go ahead and lower the pH through the aluminum sulfate, but also with the combination of peat moss breaking down and getting, soaking it into the ground. It'll keep it at a pH level, and I want to, I'm aiming for at least 5.5 over this course of this spring and summer, and as we go into fall. So I'll be doing a pH reading on a regular basis, seeing how it works. If it looks like it's turning around and the pH goes from 8 over here down to maybe, let's say 6.5, then I'll go ahead and switch over, and instead of using that much amount of aluminum sulfate that I just did, what I'll do is I'll lower that amount and cut it in half to a third, but I'll still kind of sporadically sprinkle, a little bit of peat moss on there, so as I water, it'll just go ahead and seep down in there. Because this peat moss that I checked, this typical brand that I bought at Lowe's, this brand here, I didn't see it at Home Depot, but I did see it at Lowe's. And this one, I did a pH reading every bag that I used, and the pH reading was exactly at 5.5. And so since blueberries can tolerate 4.5 to 5.5, it's going to be safe for me to go ahead and put that peat moss as a dressing onto the directly on top of the potted plants. So that's what I'm going to do here. Man, it was windy out here last night. Oh, look at that. All of my stuff just got blown away. I got to do some basic gardening maintenance, but working on plants and citrus plants and my potted trees are a lot more fun than doing actual maintenance on the yard. So I'll have to just commit to doing that. So what I'll basically do is I'll just sprinkle a little bit of this peat moss in here, and I'll go ahead and dress this. We did the pH reading already on this, and it was hovering right around 6.75. And so it's not really in a dire situation, but it definitely can use a little bit of knockdown. I always strive to get my plants at 5.5 at a minimum. And so since we're at 6.75, which is better than the 7 to 8 range, I still want to go ahead and address the situation before it gets worse. So I'll go ahead, and this is that mixture of aluminum sulfate and peat moss. Combination of those should lower the pH level. And then as we get into late spring, early part of summer, I'll be regularly checking with the pH stick how my plants are doing. And once we get right around just under 6 and hovering right around 5.5, I'll be decreasing or maybe not using the aluminum sulfate I may even go to the using the soil acidifier since I have that whole bag. I may sprinkle a little bit of that and always sprinkle a little bit of peat moss on here as a dressing because as it waters and works its way down there, it just has a nice way of keeping the pH at a lower amount. So that's a little bit about my blueberry maintenance today, and I'll see you guys later.